Okay, we're in chapter 2 or week 2 of this module in American national government, talking about constitutional foundations, constitutional government. If you go to slide number 2, you can kind of see the general outlines of what we're going to talk about in this chapter. The first is that during the colonial period, again from 1620 to the 1760s, 1770, all right, during that time, the various colonies developed their own form of limited government and representative government. Okay, many of these were colonies or charters from England or perhaps some other nations in Europe, but the big government couldn't reach its hand over and get into the cookie jar of the colonies to a great extent because, again, they're separated by 3,000 miles. This is pre-electricity. This is pre-internet. Okay, in other words, intercontinental travel by jets and things like that. Okay, so they had to learn how to govern themselves, and they actually did a really good job of it for a period of about 150 years. Number 2, the Constitution provides for limited government. Why? How does it limit government? It defines lawful powers. Okay, it defines what each branch of government does or doesn't do, and it divides those powers among competing institutions. So in the American system, we've got a system of government that's divided horizontally, right? You've got Article 1 of the Constitution, the legislative branch, Article 2 of the Constitution, the executive branch, Article 3 of the Constitution is the judicial branch, Article 4 of the Constitution is state governments, okay? So it's separated horizontally, but then it's also separated vertically, right? Is that you've got national government, you've got state government, and you got local government or county governments, things of that nature in cities. So the founders tried to distribute government horizontally and vertically, and by doing that, by not concentrating power in one place, the thinking was you're going to limit government. Number 3, the Constitution in its original form provided for representative government mainly through indirect methods of electing representatives. When they say indirect, that means the common person like you or I are not electing a senator. They're not electing a president, okay? We are delegating to individuals who then will in turn elect that senator or elect that president. Think the Electoral College. That's an example of indirect electing, okay? Number 4, the idea of popular government, okay? This idea that, well, we don't want indirect elections. We want to elect people ourselves, okay? Think of the movement, and you heard this after the 2016 election when Trump became president, and the Democrats were crying foul and saying, listen, had we not had that pesky old Electoral College, our candidate, Clinton, won the popular vote, so she would be president, okay? So there's a movement within America where people are crying out for more popular government. In other words, let us decide. We don't want to delegate as much to other representatives, okay? So we'll talk about that. Slide number 3, I've got a quote here, again, from probably one of my favorite books of all time when it deals with government. It's called A Free People's Suicide by Os Guinness. Os Guinness is a social critic, and he talks about this idea of freedom, okay? When we're talking about the Constitution, what are we doing? We are ordering liberty. Remember what we talked about last time? We talked about the apple of gold in the setting of silver, as Abraham Lincoln talked about the relationship between the Constitution and the Declaration of Independence. The Declaration is that apple of gold. It's the picture. The Constitution is the frame. Okay, the idea that liberty must be ordered. It cannot be unbridled, okay? And one of the things that the founders were thinking about was how can we create sustainable freedom, sustainable liberty that will last for all time? In other words, it's one thing to beat the Brits, right, in a war and gain your liberty. But it's quite another thing for that liberty to be enjoyed by generation after generation after generation after generation after generation after generation of Americans, millions upon millions upon millions of Americans going for hundreds, if not thousands of years in the future, okay? The founders were thinking of that at all time. What kind of a system can we create that will lead to the greatest degree of human flourishing and freedom and liberty for all, for generation after generation, okay? And so one of the things that Guinness talks about, I think this is really important, is he says freedom always faces 3 challenges, okay? First of all, it faces an historical challenge, okay? Although it's glorious, free societies are few and far between, okay? the idea that if you had the entirety of human history on a clock, okay, the amount of time allotted to free societies like the United States or a Great Britain or in Australia or something like that would be this little bitty sliver of time. It would be from 11:59 to 12 o'clock, okay? Just this little bitty sliver, okay? In other words, we tend to think, because we've been raised in this environment, we've been raised in freedom, freedom of speech, freedom of religion, freedom to petition government, freedom to own guns, and so on and so forth. We think, hey, you know, everybody has this, okay? Let me just take all of you, let's go on a class field trip to North Korea with Kim Jong-un, who President Trump calls Little Rocket Man. Let's just go spring breaking in North Korea, okay? First of all, none of us would probably survive. And if we did survive, we'd be pretty messed up, okay? Because they have concentration camps there. It's a kind of a totalitarian type of regime, okay? Is that we've got to realize that freedom is precious. And freedom is not something that just happens, okay? You've got to create the right environment to foster that type of freedom, okay? This is something, again, we'll talk about in the last chapter of the whole class, but you know, this is something that the Americans dealt with in Iraq from 2003 to 2010 or so, right? Is the thinking is, hey, let's take out Saddam Hussein, okay? So you remove Saddam Hussein. So let's impose democracy in a box, right? Let's bring American-style democracy and just impose it upon the Iraqi people. They're going to have free elections, they're going to have a free society and all that kind of stuff. And what they found is, if you know, these people did not have a history of self-government. They did not have a history of voting for their leaders, okay? Their leaders were all chosen for them or through some sort of military dictatorship or something like that. So they didn't even have the environment. So basically it collapsed. You had a power vacuum and you had, you know, breakdown of all kinds of freedoms, okay? This is what we're talking about here, that freedom always faces a fundamental historical challenge. It doesn't last for all time. Second of all, freedom faces a fundamental political challenge, okay? Free societies must always maintain their freedom at two levels, okay? First of all, at the level of the nation's constitution, okay? You've got to have a good constitution. But second of all, at the level of the citizens' convictions. If the citizens don't have the convictions of freedom or the respect for freedom or the respect for the Constitution or for respect for authority or for respect for political institutions. In other words, if you lose that respect, it doesn't matter what kind of a constitution you have, it's not worth the paper it's printed on if you've got a group of people that are not self-governing, right? And they don't respect what the nation is and has, okay? Are we dealing with that in America today? Yeah. Is there a lot of disrespect for authority today? Yeah. Okay. And I would say that, you know, this republic that we have is not sustainable when there is systemic-wide disrespect for authority at the national level, state, or local level. Okay, that's got to be restored in some way. Okay, and I would say again, I don't want to get off on this, but you know, it's at the level of the people. The people's got to have self-control and govern themselves and have respect. But politicians and leaders must comport themselves with respect. They need to live lives worthy of respect so we can respect them, okay? In other words, it's twofold. Because in a democracy, the politicians are merely a reflection of the people that voted for them. Okay, so if you can say it this way, if you don't like the politicians that are in charge at the national, state, and local level, all you gotta look at is right here, okay? Is that they are reflections of us, okay? Is that sobering? Yeah, probably. Okay. Third of all, freedom always possesses a fundamental moral challenge. I think I talked about this last week. Okay. So it faces a historical challenge. Freedom doesn't last for all time. It faces a fundamental political challenge. Okay. You've got to have a great constitution, and the habits of the heart of the people got to be good too. Third of all, it faces a moral challenge. Okay. Freedom requires order and therefore restraint. Yet the only restraint that does not contradict freedom is self-restraint, which is the very thing that freedom undermines when it flourishes, okay? You want to give people freedom, but the paradox of freedom is the more freedom you get, it starts destroying freedom, because unchecked freedom, think of a riot, okay? Think of some form of social unrest or breakdown, right? The more freedom you have, the more it weakens self-restraint. And the back end of his quote there is important. So the heart of the problem is the problem of the heart, because free societies are characterized by restlessness at their core. Okay? In other words, we love our freedom, but the problem with free societies is that there's this ongoing restlessness. I want more. Okay? I want more rights, more money. Maybe more redistribution of money, right? Always wanting more. But the problem is, if it's unchecked liberty and unchecked freedom, it's not sustainable over time. So those are those three areas that we're talking about here. As we're talking about the Constitution in this chapter, in this module, one of the things the framers were working through is, how do we order liberty, okay? How do we order that liberty? Okay, so if you go to slide number 4, I'll talk about this briefly. Before the Constitution, okay, the colonial and revolutionary experiences, okay, the colonists' admiration, okay, for limited government stemmed from their British heritage. Okay, there was something called the ancient Constitution in the British mindset. There was always this Constitution that limited the king, that limited Parliament. Okay, and so the British government did not have an absolute monarchy. Parliament, okay, which was their legislature, okay, was an independent body, and it made laws, okay, and it had local representation. And so when the colonies were set up, they were set up as, they created something called a colonial charter, like an early form of a constitution. And it conferred upon all the colonists, okay, the Americans, the rights of the Englishmen. Okay, so what were some of the rights of the Englishmen? Again, these are rights that have been going on for hundreds and hundreds of years before the American colonists came to what we call today the United States. The right of a trial by jury, okay? No execution of laws without the consent of Parliament. In other words, the king can't just go ahead and just execute laws and impose fines on people unless Parliament consented that, yes, these are the laws they created. No standing army in times of peace, right? As I do this lecture, okay, this is early June 2020, there's obviously a lot of social unrest going on in our country right now. There's riots throughout our nation, all right? And there's talk of perhaps mobilizing the U.S. Army and sending them throughout the country, okay? The founders would be bristling at that, okay? Now, that reveals a couple of things. First of all, an extraordinary exercise of government power that also recognizes an extraordinary situation and emergency that may warrant that, okay? But what the British people recognize, and again, this would go on in continental Europe, okay? France, Germany, Spain, Portugal, whatever, is that they would have the armies all over these countries in a time of peace. Again, keeping the people at bay, okay? That was something that the Englishmen were like, no, we're not going to have a bunch of standing armies around here in times of peace, okay? The government will serve the people. The people will not serve the government, okay? That's a huge value there, okay? The right to bear arms, okay, was something that the Brits had that was transferred over to us. No cruel and unusual punishment, okay, was transferred over. Freedom of speech, okay? These are rights of Englishmen that were conferred, and again, just by virtue of the British, the Englishmen traveling over to the colonies, they brought those rights over there. So a lot of these colonies, and a lot of these little states observed all of these. These were really, really important, okay? If you go to slide number 5, and I'll close with this, the thing we got to realize is for about 150 years, from the 1620s to the about 1770 or so, give or take, all of these colonies had experience in self-government. Each colony had an elected representative assembly. They were subject to British oversight, but they possessed important legislative powers. Most colonists were Protestants, so they belonged to sects, S-E-C-T-S, or churches that had what's called self-governing congregation. They had a congregational model, so they chose the pastor based on the vote of the members of the church. They made decisions based on the voting of the members of the church, okay? And that was spread throughout all the colonies, and so people realized, listen, we're doing things. The King of England did not have a whole lot of power over the British colonies in the American, in North America, because these people were so used to doing it themselves. Remember, we talked about this last time about individualism in America, okay? Is that, hey, for about 150 years, the British government left the colonies alone. And so they realized, listen, if we don't figure things out, we're not waiting for the government to do it, we'll figure it out ourselves, okay? So the American Revolution was partly a rebellion against Britain's failure to uphold the colony's established traditions, okay? Is that they realized, hey, Brits, you're not even upholding your own traditions. And that's why we're rebelling against you. But I'll stop there.